Welcome everyone to the 49th Virtual Roundtable on Measuring Corruption. I am your host, as always, Joseph Pochia Alvarez, and I'm very happy to be hosting today's presentation by Lucio Picci, who many of you are very familiar with already. He has been doing some terrific work in relation to cross-border corruption and among other areas of research. So I very much look forward to listening to his presentation and asking many questions. I had the pleasure of meeting Lucio here in Kyoto last year, and I caught a brief version of of today's topic. And I had so many questions, not because it wasn't clear, but because I'm also fascinated by the topic. I just wanted to know more about the methodology and about the data. And so I'm very happy that I was able to convince Lucio to present his work now at the beginning of 2026. Before I invite him to start his presentation and also to tell us more about himself, I just want to remind everyone to please keep their microphones off. Sorry. If you have any questions or comments during the presentation, you're more than welcome to ask them. Just click the hand emoji, or you can also wave your hand to the camera, and I'm gonna be looking, and then I will interrupt Lucio and invite you to ask your question or make the comment. Okay. So please don't be shy. The round table thrives when there's more active debate and conversation. And as you already know, more than a few of you have been with us throughout a number of sessions. A few of you have also presented in the past, as my dear colleague Michela Naldi, who is here as well. So I look forward to a very interesting conversation. I don't want to take more of your time. Lucio, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Joseph. It's a great pleasure to be here, even if virtually. But we're lucky to have these opportunities. And just a very few words about myself, just a bare minimum that kind of justifies the approach that I will take. My background is originally in economics and actually in quantitative methods. So I started my academic career as an econometrician. But then, I shifted and I started doing other things and increasingly do other things. And I have kind of or try to have a multidisciplinary approach. But my old love for quantitative information and affection has never really disappeared. And I think, it shows in my work, which is always has some kind of quantitative element, but increasingly so in a critical way. To me, numbers are not just as it will emerge in this presentation. You will see. Hopefully, this is my goal at least. The numbers tell us much more than numbers. It's really kind of a tricky and a fascinating way to approach research questions, in my personal opinion, to use quantitative information. So it will be well beyond that. Don't worry. It's not going to be. I show you some stuff that has quite a bit of heavy-duty number crunching behind, but I'm certainly not going to the details. I'm trying to provide a broad picture just to give more of a feeling about stuff, but we will go well beyond that, hopefully. So let me share the screen again. My apologies if I don't see your hands raised. You want to stop me, please. Also use the mic because in sharing the screen, I may just not be aware of of your question. So please do stop me. Feel free to stop me anytime and ask questions. And I'll try to keep an eye also on the other screen. So, measuring corruption across borders. And I would like to start with an image which I like very much, which is a fairly well-known drawing, 1948, by the Dutch artist Escher, which is called The Drawing Hands for obvious reasons. And I think that it summarizes well when we talk about measures, a kind of a conventional point of view about measuring stuff in the social sciences is that you define a concept, and then you try to measure that. It's as simple as that. But in fact, it is never really that simple, and it's never goes in simply in one direction. It's not just one hand drawing like a concept and defining that concept, because there is also always a feedback loop. So it's really measures and concepts that are kind of defining and drawing each other in this convoluted way that this drawing by Escher kind of makes apparent. And in particular, when we measure something, not just corruption, but any social concept, we contribute to a crystallization of that concept in ways that then we tend to take for granted without discussing. And that is something that we should be aware of. And also, we tend to narrow that concept. So a good example that I'm just going to mention briefly that has nothing to do with corruption is gross domestic product, which is probably the most popular, famous statistics in economics, and that we use and read about, not just in the academic literature, but in the press, the news, read about GDP growth rates and stuff like that. Well, we use that. Actually, historically, it's a fairly recent concept. It grew out of the debates on national accounts in the 1930s in some countries like the US, the Netherlands, and the UK. But it's a concept that is really not. It could have been defined differently. I mean, we could have there was actually a debate on what kind of measure to use, and this one was the one that won out, and that now we take for granted, and we don't discuss that. We teach our students first course in macroeconomics. We give them 3 equivalent definitions of gross domestic product, and we kind of forget about all the details. So that's just one example, but it really tells us a lot that applies to our interest in corruption. As you all know, I mean, I think all practitioners in the field of practitioners or researchers, I mean, in the sense that we all deal with corruption in some way, different either as academics or as practitioners, and we know that there are measures of corruption. But the important point that we tend to forget sometimes, in my opinion, is that the ones that are available have shaped and also limited our understanding of corruption. And also they have contributed in important ways in the current paradigm of both corruption and how to fight corruption. So here it is, this image of the drawing hands that I would like to take as, the starting and ending point in a way of my presentation today, and we will see that with some concrete examples that when we talk about measures, we're really just providing one facet of a multifaceted story and different stories, and that's what really makes me particularly fascinated by quantitative measures, precisely because they're just not about quantities, even if apparently so straightforward numbers, but they tell us much more actually. So what we talk about, we propose kind of a medley of different works. Let me just quickly mention them. Well, there is this book that I published in 2024 with Cambridge University Press, which is kind of an endpoint of several years of research titled Rethinking Corruption. In case you're interested, there is a more affordable paperback coming out in a few weeks. So the price which can be afforded and not use $100 or euros for academic books. And then we'll present some results. So this is by myself, but we'll present some work with 2 co-authors and friends, Lorenzo Crippa, who's at Strathclyde Universities in Glasgow, and Eddie Maleski, who's at Duke University. And we have a recent paper out, which is this Making Bribery Profitable Again, which just came out in international organization. Also, I'm going to present some new results, which is kind of an interesting, in my opinion, update of the results that we presented in this paper and that we've prepared in these days. It's not formally accepted, but it probably will come out as an article for Foreign Affairs, the policy journal in international relations. And then also we'll mention work that I've done with Larni Escresa, who's at the University of the Philippines in Manila. And in particular, we cite a World Bank Economic Review paper, which was kind of the beginning of a research project that has to do with international corruption, cross-border corruption, which is, again, the broad topic of today. So again, when we think corruption across borders, what do we mean? I don't know what you think about that. I mean, if you read the title of this presentation, international corruption, what is that? Well, again, we have to, before we look at numbers, start kind of think that it's not so obvious. And let me just provide an example, which is actually cited from my book, where I consider the case of the war in Afghanistan. And here is a short quote from the book. One critical logistical challenge for the United States was supplying troops in a large, mountainous, and landlocked country that was never fully secure. Corruption was considered an indispensable tool to achieve this crucial goal. According to Whitlock, who's a journalist for the Washington Post, who wrote an interesting book about the disaster, in a way, that we know how it ended. During the Biden administration, the United States withdrew from Vietnam a few years ago. And according to this author, the single biggest generator of corruption was the US military sprawling supply chain. And to ensure deliveries, trucking companies paid fat bribes to warlords, police chiefs, and Taliban commanders to guarantee safe passage through the turf. The situation had escalated to the point where a 2010 congressional report called the system a vast protection racket that was underwritten. So in Afghanistan, corruption was not really a problem in a way, but it was rather the solution to a problem in a context of a fundamentally misguided military mission. And so, as a side note, we see in this case that corruption acted as a tool of government, which is one of the main points that I make in my book, that we tend to forget that corruption actually is quite effective to solve problems. We tend to forget that corruption works well. And I'm certainly not defending it, but when we want to think how it is persistent, we should think that it is quite effective. And for the United States, it was an indispensable, I would add, tool to try to get work done in Afghanistan in a situation where there were arguably no other available tools of governance to ensure just the basic need of supplying the troops on the ground. So here, but this example tells us that, well, in this case, do we measure this kind of corruption? We don't. It's not a crime. I mean, the U.S. public officials who paid huge amounts of money in bribes in Afghanistan obviously were never prosecuted. And actually, in every country, the security services, secret services have dedicated funds to bribe people abroad, informants, public officials, you name it. So you may think it's obvious, but it's not really that obvious. Meaning that actually the data that I will present shortly certainly do not include this type of corruption, which we tend to take for granted, and regardless of whatever we may think, maybe even from a moral point of view about this fact. But it's there, we don't measure that, and there is no reasonable way to measure that. I mean, we know that in Afghanistan it was huge by the occupation forces, not only, I'm sure that also the other countries that had soldiers there used the same tools, including Italy, which was also involved in the military operations in Afghanistan. Italy meaning my country, I mean the country which I'm a citizen. So,
Lucio, may I interrupt for a moment?
Sure.
Thank you. Because I have a question about the concept or the way that we think about corruption across borders. So I was actually talking with a colleague recently about this, and when you gave the example of Afghanistan, I thought about the work by Sarah Chase, right? She wrote many years ago that book Thieves of State when reflecting about how corruption also threatens American national security and war efforts in other parts of the world. Now, the ANCAC, right, the one of the most foundational, not foundational, but one of the broadest frameworks that we utilize to think about corruption in legal terms internationally, it deals with transnational bribery or foreign bribery, right? But it doesn't seem to have much space to incorporate transnational corruption or corruption across borders in some of the ways that you refer, for example, in your case of Afghanistan, and that Sarah Chale did in her book. And I was wondering what you thought about that, especially since the sister convention, which is the UNTOC, right? The United Nations Convention Against Organized Crime, um, transnational organized crime. That convention provides at the very beginning kind of like a definition of transnationality, right? To understand what is the difference between regular organized crime and transnational organized crime, right? ANCAC doesn't have that definition of transnationality, I assume,
No.
because they didn't give enough attention to the issue of cross-border corruption. But what do you think about that? I mean,
About the way it is defined. Well,
yeah, I
in
mean,
this,
or like I wonder if you find that your the conversation about transnational corruption fits still within ANCAC, or is something that was left aside? Is it something new? Like how do you see
well,
it?
I'll get to the international regime. Actually, I don't want to anticipate what I'm going to discuss shortly, but the big beginning was the Foreign Corrupt Practice Act of 1977. And it's actually quite interesting on purpose. I mean, I chose example of Afghanistan, not because I wanted to quote unquote pick on the United States, but because it makes the contrast and the contradiction between what we think of international cross-border corruption in legal terms, which originated from but I'm going to get to that shortly. But the fact that, the FCPA has nothing to say about U.S. bribing in Afghanistan or Italian bribing in Afghanistan, because that was not included, in that. It's not. Again, secret services bribe all the time abroad. I just wanted to make an example of how, again, our definition, we should not take our definitions for granted. Also within the broader debate, I'm going to get to that, of, the so-called crisis of the current paradigm on corruption. And one of the critiques, certainly one of the critiques at eye level against on this, is that the concept has become too narrow. So, at this stage, I would just like to propose, so to speak, the proverbial food for thought. But then, maybe I will address better your question also as I get into the FCPA and so forth. So for now, let's just consider this contradiction. I would think it can be legitimately be called a contradiction of the fact that, again, we have types of cross-border bribes that are totally not considered, and we tend to forget about them, but they're there. And we certainly we don't measure them. There is no reasonable way to measure how much money the United States Secret Services or any country's secret services are paying abroad. Even if I may add that, for example, in Europe, this has now reached the higher level of attention following, say, the war in Ukraine, accusations from both parties of being involved domestically, this kind of debate. So it's certainly there, but measuring it's complicated. It's impossible, I would say. There is no effort. And my measures will be on a different concept of cross-border corruption. So let me resume, and then maybe we focus on cross-border bribes. And the beginning, the story, why we can do that, we have the data, I think it's really fascinating. And actually, it originates in the 70s, and Japan was a big place for that, because in the 1970s, there was a huge scandal, the Lockheed scandal, Lockheed being Lockheed Corporation, which is still one of the major companies in defense, United States based. And in the 1970s, in the aftermath of it's a story that probably most of you know, maybe all of you, but let me be quick on that. In the aftermath of the Watergate scandal, it became apparent that Lockheed Corporation and many other American corporations had routinely paid bribes to secure contracts abroad. And Lockheed was a big case. I was a kid at the time, and I remember that. Italy was involved just as badly as Japan, where Prime Minister Koizumi Tanaka had to resign and was actually eventually arrested and convicted for the sale of Lockheed airplanes. Different model. In Italy, it was the Hercules C-130, which are, the transport airplanes of Italian to this day. So they're Italian Air Force, military Air Force, and different airplanes for Japan. But it was like a huge scandal. And the fascinating story really emerged out of that. And then it really opened the policy window that allowed to do some very interesting stuff. And in particular, the FCPA, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act of 1977, as we know, made it illegal for US companies to pay bribes abroad. And also, it imposed stringent record-keeping requirements, the idea being that in order to pay bribes, you need to have slush funds. So if I make it harder for you as a company to have these slush funds, in Spanish we call them probably caja B, the B accounts. The two things go together, meaning that particularly if you are in the public companies, then you have more stringent regulations, say SEC regulations in the United States or in every country. So that was the idea. And again, it emerged from Watergate revelations of widespread corporate slush funds and illicit payments. But it's also interesting to note that geopolitical concerns played a big role. If you read the debate, there was a committee headed by a US senator. His name was Church, the Church Committee. It's quite clear that those legislators were worried about the fact that corporate bribery was undermining, the United States claim of holding the high moral ground against the Soviet Union, which was, the Soviet Union after the Watergate, they had a field day criticizing crony capitalism in the United States and the fact that it was inherently corrupt in their view. So it was really also an ideological battle during this late stage of the Cold War. And also certainly, and this goes back, Joseph, to something that you were mentioning, there was a fear that corrupt payments could create covert ties between U.S. companies and foreign leaders, thus jeopardizing national security. So there was this big debate, quite interesting to see the origin of this landmark piece of legislation, which was the 1977 FCPA. That was the beginning of everything. But then we all know that policy windows, by definitions, they're windows, and they at some point they just are over. And in the case of the United States, quite quickly, the mood of the country changed. The Carter administration lasted until 1980. Then they badly lost the presidential elections against the former governor of California, a guy whose name was Ronald Reagan, who then served 2 terms. And the mood of the country changed. And then the American corporate world didn't like the FCPA a bit, because with some reasons they thought that that they were being put at a competitive disadvantage compared to corporations from other countries, say European countries, that could continue happily paying bribes to secure markets abroad. So what did they do? The United States acted in 2 parallel ways, anyway. On the one hand, they extended the reach of the law beyond US citizens to foreign companies under special legal circumstances. That is, they created the basis for an expansive interpretation of jurisdiction. That's one key element that happened in the late 80s, actually. I'll get to that. And secondly, they started. One thing that they could have done, let me backtrack just briefly. One thing that they could have done is simply to repeal the FCPA, but that was not politically feasible in a way, because it was like admitting, hey, well, not back then. Maybe we are getting close to that now, but that's kind of a spoiler to the end of the story. It was like saying, hey, we were joking, bribes are good, and so it was not doable politically. It was not politically feasible. So they did, on the one hand, they expanded the jurisdiction, created the basis for this very expansive interpretation of jurisdiction. And secondly, they started lobbying abroad, trying to get other countries on board. They first tried with the United Nations, they failed. but then the United States was successful within the OECD, and the result was again, I've said that was the FCPA, the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention of 1997. But before that, let me quickly note that on the fact that before that, the FCPA was not really successful. There was very little implementation. But that the big change again was in 1998 when Congress expanded the statute to encompass foreign companies who, while in the territory of the US, take an act in furtherance of corrupt scheme, regardless whether the underlying bribery occurred. So these really gave them leverage to go after, to target foreign companies. And let me also anticipate that these, and it's an important part of the, the end of the story, is still true today. So the United States have in their arsenal the Department of Justice. They have in their arsenal the possibility to target foreign companies. Let's keep this in mind because it plays an important role in understanding some very recent events during this first year of the current Trump administration. So these provisions have been interpreted by U.S. enforcement agency. When I say U.S. enforcement agency, I mostly mean the Department of Justice, also the SEC, because of the other provisions on transparency. But the DOJ is really the big player here, broadly. And as we know, there have been some very important cases that kind of anecdotically provided the proof of what I just said. One is a very famous and often cited case of Siemens, the German multinational companies that back in 2008 was fined close to $500 million in criminal fines and also 350 million to the SEC. And also, Alstom is another big case, a French company, and many others. So there is a big number of cases. I will show you some data later on. So again, the United States were eventually successful in trying to level the playing field when in 1997, within the OECD, this anti-bribery convention was signed. It entered into force in 1999 and now binds 46 countries, all the OECD countries and some more. And the signatories committed to doing the same things that the United States had done back in 1977. That is, item number one, criminalize foreign bribery, and item number two, actually instituting transparency in terms of to make it more difficult to have slush funds. And also, item number three, if you wish, submit it to a system of peer review, which is quite interesting. I will tell you something more about that, meaning that within the OECD, as you sure know, there is like a working group that considers, that has been considering how well, or maybe not well, the countries have abided to their obligations under the OECD anti-bribery convention. And the peer reviews has had different phases. Now the current phase is phase number 4. They began, phase number 1 was simply to see whether they had done the approved the necessary laws in each countries, and then phase number 3 was really the game changer, because scrutiny, which started in 2009, 2010, phase number 3 marked the time when scrutiny shifted toward the actual enforcement outcomes. And we have actually, the data show that it was after phase 3 that the system really began to work as intended, with number of enforcement actions by signatory countries that more than doubled after 2010 approximately compared to the first year. So, this regime, it didn't start working right away, which is understandable. It's quite interesting because, it's an important case study, not just for students of corruption, but in international relations more widely. And actually, my recent works is I'm going to discuss that a little bit. We were publishing them in political science journals like International Organization, for example. So it's a big interest for more than one reason. One is for the question of compliance to treaties. This convention is a treaty in terms of international law, hard law in international law. So the problem of what determines compliance to international treaties is a big deal for IR people. And so this is a very interesting case because it's one of the most coherent multinational international agreement. And then another question that we address and I'm going to discuss today is the issue of leakage. Meaning that if not everyone is on board, then it could well be that the countries that are on board are put at a disadvantage with respect to the others, and also the activities that you're trying to outlaw, maybe they shift to the countries that are not involved. Let me give you a simple example of just to just provide a wider picture. The issue of leakage is very much discussed now by researchers who work on global warming. Because if we make a treaty to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases and not all the countries are on board, then there is a possibility that the companies of the countries that are affected, maybe they're going to shift the production to countries that have not signed the treaty. So that is a very serious concern. Actually, the empirical evidence on this seems to show that this is not the case, but it's a big question, obviously, because it really has huge policy implications on whether these treaties are effective or not. It could even be that if the leakage is very important, they could even be counterproductive. So just to show you that it is a big debate that goes well beyond our personal interest in corruption. I see a hand raised. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. So I don't know if this really goes into the way that the data is collected and analyzed. So please correct me if this is not relevant really. But I was wondering about the nature of these two cases or regimes that you have been discussing. So the first one, of course, the FCPA that got revamped in the late 1990s and it started 2000 really switched gears, right? Like over the last 10 years, we've seen like almost every year is like a new record in terms of uh, uh, fines and asset recovery, etc., etc. The Now that the US, for what I understand, is able to have such a strong approach to it and to extraterritoriality because of the huge financial hub that it represents. And to a certain degree, I understand that the UK with a 2010 anti-bribery act is also able to do the same because of the international financial profile that it has. Now, when it comes to the OECD convention. It also includes a number of Latin American countries that, even though they are not, like some of them are OECD, others are not, but they have become part of the anti-bribery convention. I think that even Peru, my own country now, is part of a signatory to
Yes,
the convention as well.
it's one of the, I don't remember now the year, but yes, you're right.
Right. So the incentive for joining that group is more reputational, or the way I see it, right? So that the fact that the incentives to comply or to follow compliance with these two types of regime, does it alter at all our discussion in terms of transnational corruption or cross-border corruption? Is it something that affects efforts to analyze cases at all, or is independent?
Well, you mean I didn't get the question. I mean, so yeah. One thing is that certainly there is a reputational element. I mean, for OECD countries, you are part of the club; they all sign. But then,
Right.
why did Peru or Colombia, for example, decide to join? It's a reputational signal. I don't know. I mean, I'm not cognizant of the debate that took place, say, in Peru, but certainly it's a way to show that you belong to the club, or that you're close to belonging to the club. So, and that you are a good citizens in terms. So this is one thing. How does it affect like the way we know the information? Maybe you didn't get the question.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah.
So sorry. Let me kind of rephrase my question there. So when we look at cases of foreign bribery, or we look at the level to which companies comply with anti-bribery regimes, right? So you have the North American regime like the FCPA, and you have the European regime that is dispersed across the countries, but formalizing the OECD convention and the way that they implement those provisions.
Yeah.
The fact that I don't know that the US approach, or the way that they are able to enforce compliance, is I guess rooted in a different type of incentives. Like I'm trying to understand how
Okay.
these
Yeah.
incentives are constructed
Certainly.
and
I
how that
mean,
affect the cases.
maybe when I tell you something about the data, it will become clear. But let me anticipate that certainly we have, when we get the data, the first question is, what can we do with this data? I mean, the data from the case. Let me get to the data first, and then maybe you are, because that is where probably it's going to be easier to discuss the question that you're raising, which is very important. So let me. So again, with phase 3, it was when. And then it's important that actually Joseph goes at least some inches in the direction of answering to the questions. That the FCPA was the cornerstone of the whole system. Why? Because the US paired internationalization with, again, let me underline that, an expansive EU jurisdiction, pursuing cases not only against US firms, but also against foreign companies. For example, those listed in US markets, which are very important, and approximately 16% of all OECD ABC cases were initiated by US in the US against foreign companies. So a big number. So in a way, the United States played cop of the world in this, and that had an important role, because this high-profile prosecution of non-US companies reinforced the regime, but also, let me underline this, pressured other governments to strengthen their own enforcement. I mean, the implicit threat was that, dear Italy, if you don't go after this company, which is paid probably bribes in that country, I, the Department of Justice, I'm going to intervene. So you'd better do it yourself. I mean, I'm not saying that there was this kind of talk, but the implicit message was certainly this one. Okay. So this is really key, and also in light of what we will discuss later on. And actually, I used was, was the cornerstone of the system. And so what happened afterwards, I don't want to spoil the story, even if you know, probably, but the story is to be continued. So let me stop now the historical reconstruction. I will leave to the end the last 12 months, literally, or 11 months and a half. And let me now tell you something about the data and what we can do with them. So again, this table is from the 2017 paper, the most updated version of the database. The numbers are slightly different, but just to tell you the bottom story. So we have, say, approximately 1,500 cases. Well, here you see this number here, right? That we observe of cases that, again, why do we observe them? Well, precisely because they were made a criminal offense, first by the FCPA and then by the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention. So this number here, well, actually, this is the updated version. So these numbers are approximately correct, but it's not so important. Now, here you have a very important thing, that a concept that I don't want to go into the details. I invite you, if you're interested, to read, the stuff that we wrote on this. But let me just provide you with a very basic intuition. So if I look at how many cases we have, how many cases involve US companies, for example, we see that it is a very big percentage of the total number of cases. So can we conclude that can we conclude that US companies are more corrupt than other companies? Obviously not. The reason why we see so many companies involved, well, maybe also they have a propensity to bribe abroad, no doubts. But the reason why we see that such a big percentage of the total number of companies being prosecuted during 20 years are headquartered in the US is because the United States have been particularly proactive in going after these types of cases. So there has been in the United States a high degree of judicial activism. So it would be obviously stupid to infer from the fact that there are many companies involved the conclusion that United companies have a high propensity to pay bribes abroad. However, we can leverage on the information on where a case was originated. So if I see that many companies from the United States are involved in cases that did not appear in the United States, but in other countries, then yes, I can make some kind of inference on the propensity of US companies to bribe. And the same applies if I want to have information on the propensities of public officials to receive bribes. So if I see that of all the companies, the United States companies bribing abroad, say, I'm just making up numbers, I don't want to pick on countries, 50% of them are bribes being paid in China, then that would lead me to maybe conclude that Chinese public officials have a high propensity to accept bribes. You know, if it's like 50% more than I would expect, for example, by considering trade flows. Suppose that the United States exports to China only, say, 20% of their exports, but that 50% of the bribes paid by US firms are paid in China. Okay, so that would give me the idea that corruption in China is high. So a key information is on where a case was first enforced. And we had, worked quite hard to code all the cases, or almost all of them, looking at sources in open, media and other databases already existing. You see the details, the methodological details, if you're interested, are all available. And this allows us to build two measures of corruption, actually. Let me show you the two measures. So one is a measure of which we call Public Administration Corruption Index, which introduced in a paper in World Bank Economic Review 2017 with Larni and Scresa, where we use cases first enforced not in the foreign country meaning where the possibly bribing officials are, to make a measure of the corruption of public administration. I will show you what we get soon, very soon, actually. Next slide. So the logic again is that we look at the geographic distribution of cases from an external point of view, where the cases was enforced first. And then the other measure is on the propensity for companies to bribe abroad, and we call that the Bribe Payers Corruption Index, in a paper 2018. The methodology of the two measures is really the same. We just take a different point of view. So this, I thought, back then was a clever, clever idea of coming up with measures of corruption that are comparable in logic to the ones that we are familiar with. I'll get to your question shortly, Joseph, like Transparency International, CPI, or other measures. We'll discuss them briefly, but are not based on perceptions, are based on real data, observed cases, used in a smart way so that they're not prone to the accusation that we can make of all judicial statistics that they depend on judicial activism. Joseph.
Yes, this is actually a question from David Sotola, who posted it
on David, yeah. Hello, hi.
Meeting chat. Yes, of course. So he's asking about some point that you shown the previous table about the positive cases. So he's wondering about the meaning of that term, positive cases.
Yeah, sure. No, that's a good question. I was too quick. So we have that's just a quick summary. But the idea is that of a case can be positive, simply mean that it ended with finding that there was a bribe. Okay, or it ended, in the case of the United States, I think it's here, concluded with a judgment in favor of the prosecution or also a settlement. So we take, for example, a cease and desist agreement in the US as evidence that there was corruption. I mean, technically, I'm not, a law guy, but technically, you could say that it is not it is not necessarily the admission of fault, but if a company accepts to pay money, in practical terms, we think that something will happen. Okay, so that would be positive. Then it would be ongoing for cases that they're still pending, or maybe you have a few cases that simply disappeared in a given jurisdiction, and so for us these are ongoing. And then we also have discarded. So discarded plus ongoing plus positive, that makes a case. Okay, so here we get into some details on how we can do our stuff. So our idea is that these cases have a high burden of proof. So our preferred results are always with all the cases. We could talk about individual cases that ended in acquittals, some of them in my country, for example, where I would not name these cases because I would get probably a bad letter from a lawyer of a big multinational that can spend a lot of money in lawyers. But we know that there was bribing in some cases, but it ended in an acquittal. So that's one thing. But then for robustness analysis, we also just use a positive and we get the same results. But certainly using all of them gives us more data, because we have this is more or less 1,500. It's a lot, but it is not huge lot of data. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I have another question concerning the next slide, where you present very quickly the two indices that you were able to build from the data set,
Yeah.
the Public Administration Corruption Index and the Bribe Payers Corruption Index. So
Yeah.
could you walk us through a little bit about the logic behind, like, dividing the data between the information coming from the home country or the foreign country? Because I find it very interesting. I want to understand exactly what was the rationale to divide it into two different indices.
Yeah. Okay. So the two phenomena are different. One phenomenon is about public administration being corrupt or not, and this is very close. And actually, I'll show you a comparison very soon with the logic of Transparency International Corruption Perception Index. I mean, to be quite honest, the type of measure of the concept of corruption that the TI-CPI tries to measure is by definition unknown, because as we all know, the Transparency International Corruption Index is a meta-index that puts together several indices, each one with its own definition. So we don't really know what it measures. That's one of the limitations of this, the most famous probably measures of corruption that we have. But yes, it does. Certainly, it has to do with corruption of public administrations. I mean, again, within the narrow definition of corruption that we now have, which corresponds to the crime of corruption, tends to correspond to some extent to the crime of corruption, that is bribes. We know that bribes can also be paid to and by two private companies, like an official in a private companies that accepts bribes to buy stuff. That's also corruption. But our focus is really on public administration corruption when we think of corruption. So this is what the PACI, the Public Administration Corruption Index, because it looks at the propensity of public officials to accept bribes from abroad. Now, you could actually make the point that maybe they have a different propensity to accept bribes from foreign corporations and from domestic companies. That could make the point. We argue that it's reasonable to think that there should not be systematic differences, that at least to. But when we see actually the comparison with the TI-CPI, I don't want to spoil you, but it's interesting. So. Hold on with that. With that, the propensity to bribe abroad, let me give you some background information, actually, even if it's not reflected in my PowerPoint presentation. But back in, I don't know, 15 years, Transparency International proposed a measure So the critique, the reason why they proposed that was within the debate, kind of north-south, global north, global south debate, where, as you know, countries from the global south were named and shamed by Transparency International, and they were saying, I think with some reasons, but look who's, we are corrupt, quote unquote, but look at who's bribing our public officials. We buy things from companies that are based in the global north. We have financial services which are all based there. So you're doing the dirty job just as we do. That was kind of the debate. And actually, just to an anecdote, I was involved working for the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa about 10 years ago in Addis Ababa. We wrote a report, and you can think about, the political context of the United Nations, which is complicated to say the least, understandably so. And so those kind of debates, we were there in Africa, working in Africa, looking at corruption in Africa, was certainly present. We had to write that, and no problem for me because I totally agree. So Transparency International, to answer to that, made this measure that was called the BPCI, I think, at one point. And that measure told this following story broadly, that those countries that, so the measure was available only for rich countries, because, a company from Tanzania will not bribe abroad, not necessarily because they're honest, but because there are very few companies in Tanzania who can contest foreign markets abroad. You do not have Tanzania, just to say a country in Africa, with a low level, with a low GDP. So it was available for mostly rich countries, some Latin American countries too, like Argentina, for example. And the story was quite interesting because their measure was highly correlated with the TI-CPI. So the idea was that, for example, Italy, within the rich countries, for example, my country has a fairly high level of perceived corruption according to the TI-CPI, while also it had a fairly high level of perceived propensity to corrupt of Italian companies abroad. Well, now I'm not defending Italy, but that measure was totally wrong. There was like some basic methodological errors that TI, Transparency International, at some point, they recognized in private, but they quietly took away that from the website, and it disappeared. You can find it in archive.org, but it disappeared, and they never even acknowledged. Why? Because they asked questions made mistakes, methodological mistakes, and the person's answering, not knowing what to answer, they were simply proposing again their general idea of corruption in a country. So if you know nothing about the propensity of a company from, say, Brazil to bribe abroad, but you have the idea that Brazil corruption is fairly high, there is a psychological mechanism, which is the heuristics of, the availability, what you have close to the information that you have to close. You probably say that Brazilian companies have higher propensity to bribe abroad, even if you never experienced, you don't have any hands-on experience. So that is. But let me show you the results, because let me compare. Now, the next thing that I'm going to show is a comparison of the two measures with the Transparency International measures. Actually, for the first one, you will see it's not Transparency International, but the World Bank Corruption Control Indicator, which, as we know, is very highly correlated. It's almost identical with Transparency International Corruption Perception Index. So let me go back to, so this is the first one. So you have the logarithm, forget about y, the logarithm of of our measure, the PACI, versus the World Bank Corruption Control Indicator. If instead of these, I had put here Transparency International Corruption Perception Indicator, this graph would have been almost identical. Okay? So first we see that it is negatively correlated, which is what we expect. As we know, the Transparency International Corruption Perception Indicators takes higher values for lower levels of perceived corruption. whereas the PACI, the PACI, our indicator, is the opposite. So these two indicators tell us a very similar story. You see that? I mean, here we have, say, Norway. Norway, low corruption, or the United States, or Ireland, or the Netherlands, Denmark. Here you have Denmark, you know, the quintessential good guys in terms of corruption. You see that both according to the Transparency International, well, in this case, the World Bank, but again, it's the same story, and to our indicator, very low level of corruption. Go up here, I don't know, Afghanistan, Kenya, Nigeria, very high level of corruption according to both indicators. So this, you know, when I remember 10 years ago, first time I did this graph, I said, wow, this is interesting. You know, we have two measures which are computed in a totally different way. There is no similarity in methodology. One is based on perceptions, Transparency International or the World Bank, same story. And one is based on a creative use of these matrix of flows of cross-border corruption that comes out of the FCPA, out of the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, and that tell us a similar story. So in a way, even if I've always been a big critic of the corruption perception indicator, and I think I have good reasons to critique that indicator, and I think, you know, they also acknowledge that it has many shortcomings, but it kind of vindicates that in the sense that it says that when we focus on a narrow concept of corruption, which is bribes, then perceptions are not really off the mark. So that's kind of interesting, I think. Let me now show you, however, a comparison of not of the measures of the Public Administration Corruption Index, but of the propensity of companies to bribe abroad, with a now defunct measure that Transparency International took away from the website. And now, obviously, the graph will have fewer data points because it's for fewer countries. But then you see that there is no apparent relation. I mean, look at this. So this is the Transparency International, and it tells you higher values are referred to a lower propensity to bribe abroad. So you see the good guys, Switzerland, the Netherlands, Germany. So these are the countries, Belgium, the countries that have relatively low levels of corruption according to the TICPI, and also according to Transparency International, the companies are well behaved. Whereas look at China, Russia, the bad guys, you know, high levels of corruption and also high level of the companies, high propensity of the companies to bribe abroad. Whereas if we do our measure, you see that scatter diagram, we see a story which is simply not that. We see a different story. And actually, according to our measure, the country where the companies have higher propensity to bribe abroad is Switzerland. Why? Not because we're certainly not saying that Swiss companies are, you know, worse than others, but Switzerland is a country where there are many companies, you know, it's a country with many headquarters of multinational corporations, which are the ones that in practice have the possibility to contest markets abroad through bribes. So we get a totally different story. And actually, what explains our measure is really the number of multinational corporations. So you see that, like UK, Netherlands, Switzerland, other countries such as South Africa, very low. But because there are few, actually zero, there are no cases, or India, or even China. China is lower than Switzerland. Maybe now with more corporations from China, we will see a different story. But Switzerland, we think of, we can joke about Switzerland in a way. We're very respectful, by the way. I don't know if there is any person from Switzerland here, but about Switzerland, being a very well-ordered country. In Italy, we have we tend to see them in a way as very different from us because we are. But you see that, you see the number. If you count the number of cases taking the right viewpoint, you get a result which is very different. So you see that, again, let me compare these two figures. The indicator about public administration corruption, perception-based indicator by Transparency International of the World Bank, tells us a similar story to ours, which I think is very interesting. If you look at the other one, we get a totally different story. So these measures are about a narrow idea of corruption, bribes, and well, that's not really English, but they're in dialogue in interesting ways with other measures, such as those that are based on perceptions. And again, let me underline that our measures are not based on perception, but they come from observed cases of cross-border bribes, just used in a creative way to come up with measures that can be used. One shortcoming of our measure is that, but it is common with other measures, is that they can hardly measure changes in time. Now, this is a question that I think I'm not going to make a big deal because, this presentation is about a different aspect, but let me just briefly mention this point, which I make every time, because I think it's one of these kind of black holes in the debate on measures of corruption. It is a fact that we are not good at all in measuring changes of corruption in time. And measuring levels is not the same as levels of corruption comparing countries, say. It's not the same as measuring changes in time. And actually, whenever you see using, say, the TI-CPI, year-to-year changes to infer anything, it's totally meaningless. We have some other work that I've done where we actually compare. It's very difficult to measure changes in time for reasons that, if you are interested, there is one chapter on measures in my book and other works that I've done in the past. But let's just consider that as an aside, because I have the continuation of the story on cross-border bribes that I would like to attend to. So let me go back to the FCPA. So now I give you the end of the story that I don't want to spoil in advance. So February the 10th, 2025, I don't know how you feel about it, but it seems to me, when I think about American politics, that the last 12 months have been going on for 12 years. I don't know if you have this kind of impression. If you think, that was 1 year ago, it sounds like, ages, but okay. So February 10th, 2025, it was 1 month after the inauguration of Donald Trump as president, and he was in a frenzy to sign executive orders of all types, and he signed an executive order suspending enforcement of the FCPA. Big deal. So what we did with Lorenzo Crippa, Eddie Malesky, we looked at the response by investors. And so there is a literature in finance. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but there is a literature in finance where, when you have an event, you look at the stock evaluations of companies and you compare them with the benchmark, which is done in appropriate ways using appropriate statistical techniques. There is a literature on that. We did exactly the same, and we compared two groups of countries: those that had never been the target of FCPA. Well, first of all, we focused on companies in the US stock markets, which means, however, many companies which are headquartered in the US, but many foreign companies, as you know. So we also have, you will see that we could leverage on that. And we compare, after the news, what happened to those companies that had been a previous target to the FCPA, one or more cases, with those that had not. And so fairly straightforward in a way, lots of stats here, really. But this is what we find. And actually, this is a paper that has just been published in International Organization in December. And it's if you just Google that, it's open access. So no need to go from your university or whatever. So here you have, that's the event. The vertical line is the event that we are, the effects of which we are studying. And you see, let's start with the one at the bottom. Companies that had not been target to the FCPA, you see that they follow a baseline. Whereas on top, you see this is the one that you should look at. is the effects during the week of those that have been targets of FCPA, and the vertical bars are the significance intervals. So we find quite a substantive effect. The companies that had been target of the FCPA gained a lot of money in terms of their evaluation, market evaluation, as it is provided by the stock exchange, both the New York Stock Exchange and a few others, the Nasdaq, I think. And in particular, we're talking about really a lot of money. It generated this event significant capitalization gains for the companies that were the highest risk of future corrupt activities and corresponding outsized returns for their investors. Now, why do we care? Well, actually, we care because we care about we care about the broader debates on corruption. So again, here we see how measures really can feed into different debates, it's not just measuring corruption or in this case, stock exchange. So the wider debate has to do with the effects of corruption. Is it costly for firms because it represents a tax on private initiative that reduces efficiency and certainty? That's one of the staples of the literature on corruption. Think about Susan Rose Ackerman, etc. I mean, I'm mentioning Susan because she was like one of the biggest initiator of this whole thread of literature already back in 1975 with a paper, then 1978 with a very important book. Great stuff that really changed our way of thinking of corruption. So the idea that, it's, but then, if this is the case, investors should be, which it certainly is, but we would expect to observe that investors should be reluctant to buy into companies known to bribe abroad, whether or not FCPA enforcement is in effect. I mean, if it is a cost in terms of efficiency, regardless of whether you're caught or not, you would not invest in a company which is doing things through corruption. Whereas if bribery, on the other hand, gives companies an important first mover advantage that secure monopolistic positions in foreign markets, then it's a different story. Then in this case, yes, companies will be deterred from bribing only if they face law enforcement. And so in this case, this is the case that is coherent with what we observe. What we observe is kind of supports the presence of these first mover advantages, because if we take out enforcement, that what happens is that companies, they see the stock, the market evaluation go up, making the wallets of their investors fatter than they already were. Then the idea is that the market is evaluating the fact that they can again, since they have this propensity to bribe, which our data supports. I mean, you have repeated offenders, so we demonstrate that in the paper. If you're curious, you can have a look. Then the idea is that you do need compliance. You do need enforcement in order to get companies not to try to grab this first mover advantage and secure fat and lucrative contracts abroad. So our results point to the latter motive. Once enforcement costs are lifted, investors bet that companies at risk of further corruption will be more profitable. And so our findings reinforces our understanding that strong anti-corruption mandates are necessary to deter companies from engaging in bribery, which is a policy of policy relevance, and also it's bad news considering what has been happening in the United States, which, again, let me not forget, is really the pivot of the whole system of the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, what has happened there during the last 12 months. So let me, now after that is, the graph that I showed, this one is from the paper that was published in December. Now, just last week, okay, with my co-authors, we had a look at the 12 months. And we're now writing a note that should be published, I think. I mean, it's not sure yet, but in Foreign Affairs. But we see if it comes out. But I think it's going to be published there. So the thing now, it's interesting because we have 12 months. And in these 12 months, several things happen. In particular, let me quickly summarize what happened after the February 10th. That was a pause that was supposed to last 6 months. But then before the 6 months ended, the Department of Justice had new guidelines. And then there were other announcements. And now I remember actually a conversation that I had in Kyoto, Joseph, with the person whom I'm not going to name for the simple reason that, this is going to be recorded and that it was a private conversation. But he's an important lawyer based in Tokyo. Okay. And the person. And so we were discussing, and he was telling me his point of view, and I agreed that there was a clear risk that the FCPA would be applied in a targeted way as an instrument of lawfare. That was in July when we met, I think. Then in July, that was not certain. It was, speculations. Now, let's see, after 1 year, close to 1 year, just these are very recent data that we just computed last week. I can show you some, I think, quite interesting results where we observe that. So here you have, let's first, before we look at this graph, let's look at so we have self-disclosure policy, new FCPA guidelines, an important conference. Several policy signals were communicated in the months after that's original FCPA order. And they kind of reinforced a message that the Department of Justice was going at different priorities. And it was possible to interpret that as targeting foreign companies. That was a possibility in our debate in July in Kyoto. Let's see what the data tells us. Well, this is the stock evaluation, again, compared of past offenders for companies that A, were past offenders, and B, are US companies. And you see that actually the increase goes up. So instead, we could have expected that after the first week, this goes only to February 14th. Maybe you can say after the dust settles, then the market understands that the situation goes back, enforcement is resumed after a pause, maybe it goes back. No, it happened the opposite. The difference increased. You see that. Sorry. So these for US companies. But what happens instead for companies that are not based in the US? Look at that. You had an increase at the beginning, just as for the other companies, more or less, the first month. But then what we observe is really coherent. It seems to confirm, it provides support to that theory that we were discussing in Kyoto with this important lawyer from Tokyo, which is that there could be targeting of foreign companies. And you see that foreign companies, they lost their advantage by the end of April, and then now, it's more or less here. So foreign companies, these actually are statistics, meaning that even the advantage that they had were not statistically significant. So investors, our data, most recent results, which are again very, very recent, just last week, just rerunning the same code that produced a paper that we published in December by putting new data. So it was easy to do. We already had the code. We just had to open up the window that we considered. Investors are not simply pricing the regulation. They seem to be pricing selective enforcement. And this, I think, is a big thing. I mean, at least I find it quite interesting possibility. And the FCPA is increasingly expected to shield US companies while retaining coercive force against foreign ones. And this would represent a qualitative shift in how the law functions. Instead of serving as a neutral constraint that disciplines companies regardless of nationality, it would operate as a tool of economic statecraft. I would say, enlarging our view on the broader debate, one of the tools of economic statecraft. I mean, we've seen the tariffs tool being used quite a lot during the last 12 months. So a source of discretionary leverage in trade disputes, procurement battles, and geopolitical rivalries. Just one piece of broader tendency that I would add personally, unfortunately, we are observing in the last year and the last months particularly. So let me get to the conclusions. And then, if you have questions, plenty of time, I guess, right? I guess my presentation was not long enough, given was that 2 hours, Joseph? Was,
No, we still have another 12 minutes. We had
Oh,
allotted
12
9
minutes.
minutes.
Okay. So no, because I thought, okay, so yeah, I'm done. So maybe it was more or less correct. But this is a story that I thought could be hopefully interesting for you. So I did not really think too much about how long it would last. And I know that you're a flexible person and you will not hold a grudge against me if I'm
Not at all.
yeah, so I'm done. So again, the revenue of the FCPA, OECD, ABC, I think it's a big story. Well, for many reasons. So if markets are correct, the implications extend well beyond corporate balance sheets. The OECD anti-bribery regime depends on, this is an important point, reciprocal restraint, because all governments have an incentive to free ride on that. I mean, we all have national champions. I can tell you about Italy. We have a few companies that is very different to bring to court. Because they're important, considered to be important for national security, for energy security, etc. So governments constrain their company or own firms in exchange for others doing the same. Selective enforcement by the US undermines this bargain, and other governments will have little reason, for example, to police their companies or to cooperate with Washington with the judicial inquiries by the DOJ, by the Department of Justice. Is Washington itself no longer credibly policies its own companies? And now the implications are quite possibly serious, because the US spent decades exporting and enforcing a model of extraterritorial accountability that was quite consequential in helping anchoring this rule-based, this international regime, anti-corruption international regime. And now the evidence from the financial market suggests that investors expect Washington to abandon that role. And I think that the risk of unraveling of this international regime, which started with the original historical origin, was the Watergate scandal, the Lockheed scandal, the FCPA of 1977, then fast forward 14 years or something like that, the OECD anti-bribery convention. The risk of unraveling of that is really serious. But let's not also, as persons, practitioners, researchers in corruption, keep in mind that particular international regime is also a big chunk of the anti-corruption more generally at the world level. So again, food for thought, I think, for all of us in terms of the prospects of future anti-corruption efforts at the world level, given that such a big important pillar is now definitely threatened, I believe, and our data point to the seriousness of our results, point to the seriousness of that threat. And the more generally, for students of IR, of international relations, this is how international legal orders unravel, not just through formal repeal or dramatic confrontation, but through the quiet alignment of expectations among market actors, who may conclude that the rules no longer bind them and no longer bind the most powerful player, the United States. That's the end of my story, dear Joseph. I don't know if you or other people have any questions. I'd be glad to, in the time that
Yes,
we have left.
let's open the floor. Could you stop sharing your screen now?
Sure, let me just do that.
Great. Uh, I have a couple of questions, but I don't want to monopolize the conversation too much. So, if anybody would like to start, by all means. Otherwise, I'm gonna start warming the room a little bit. Uh, so I was really taken by a term that you used towards the very end of your presentation, which is that of shielding, right?
Yeah.
Again, a lot of people in our community and in a compliance community have been discussing and debating a lot over the last year. So that's quite interesting. So the fact that the valuation of these corporations that are U.S. based, right, kind of were hiked after the decision to pause FCPA enforcement, right? That also, at least the way that I read it, and I would like to know if that's correct or what your thoughts are about it. That also speaks a lot about the power of enforcement of other players, no? because the fact that the FCPA is pulled doesn't mean that UK enforcement and enforcement in France and other parts of Europe has also paused. But the fact that companies based in the US now, or at least people investing in those companies now feel a lot more comfortable with the fact that they won't be prosecuted or investigated, that also speaks a lot about the fact that outside of the US, enforcement or investigation hasn't really been like catching up as much as we wished they were. Is that correct?
Yeah, this is certainly true. I mean, again, the statement that the United States have been the pivot of the system derives precisely. Now, I've been a little bit quick to show you the data, but you know, if you look at the papers that I mentioned, you see that. But by the fact that a big chunk of the big share of the cases have been investigated in the U.S. And many and a big chunk, a big share of the cases have been initiated in the U.S. So this is particularly the United. You correctly mentioned that the United Kingdom also, after the reform that they had post the big scandal of BAE, they also can play the same game. I mean, it's not only the United States that can have what we call third country investigations, meaning you go after companies that are not headquartered in your country. But if you look at the numbers, the United States is the country that has done this most often. So the other are more or less peanuts who've done that. The UK, some of them, but really few. And this has really put pressure on other countries. Actually, there is an old paper back in 2011, also an international organization, which made precisely this point, looking at the fact that investigations in other countries went up after the United States put pressure by doing investigations of their companies. So, you know, we have to give them their due. I mean, you know, they played a great role, in my opinion. But when great role goes out and there is not enough movement, then the other countries probably, you have a big question here, which I just mentioned at the beginning, which is international cooperation in investigations. I mean, in the end, what's going to happen to that? And we know that in those cases, collaboration is of paramount importance. You were mentioning Latin American countries. I was thinking, obviously, of the most obvious case of the many cases that of Brazilian companies during the Lava Jato. You know, Odebrecht, which was involved, for example, in many cases, and it was also investigated by the Department of Justice. There, you had a huge amount of collaboration between Brazilian judges and the DOJ. Would that happen now? I don't know. I mean, there would be second thoughts at the very minimum. So
Sure. Then I also had another question, and I make this question more on behalf of I guess people in general when talking about FCPA, more in the past than over the last 12 months, of course. There has always been that recurrent, I don't know, myth or at least perception or belief that at least the US has been able to utilize the FCPA as a way to target corporations of countries that are seen as competitors. For example, Chinese corporations or you know, like from certain specific jurisdictions. Do you find that to be true in the data or not be true?
no, it's not really supported up until now. I mean, now if you look at the data of the last 12 months or post May after the pause, I don't know because we don't have the data
Right.
of the last 12 months simply. But I mean, an indirect answer could be that we had to answer to referees on several publications precisely on this. Like, can you have like country sweeps, so-called country sweeps? Like, you know, they go after companies from one country. So we have several robustness tests of several types. We don't find that evidence. Which, I mean, I don't know. I don't want to be naive. I cannot rule out the presence of motivations, but in terms of the way the Department of Justice works or worked before up until last year, let's say. Now, I'm not going to make any statement on the way it works now. Simply, I'm not saying that it works different. I'm not going to make any statement. But you had my understanding is that you had a set of incentives where prosecutors they had big career concerns, meaning that I talked to several of them actually, informally, nothing structured, but it's like a springboard to get a well-paid job in the private sector, and you don't. It's when the revolving door. I mean, this I guess is a little bit idealistic, but works in the proper way, meaning that you don't get a good job. You won't get a good job if you are soft, but if you look that you're tough and you know what you're doing. So this is the story that they tell you. I mean, maybe it's also self-interest. I don't know enough, to be quite honest. I mean, I don't have like really detailed knowledge of the DOJ works, but that's more or less my understanding. And anyhow, if you just look at our data, we find no evidence of country sweeps or targeted
Right.
targeted prosecution.
I think that a paper could be written just on that finding, I feel, because again, you mentioned if the reviewers brought that up as well, because it has been regularly discussed, and we didn't really have data to either support or reject that
Absolutely,
premise.
absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
And of course, I mean, as you said, the last 12 months feel like 12 years, right? Because a lot of that part of the discussion kind of, yeah, it's not really applicable anymore, because now the concern that people are having is that indeed it will be weaponized for interference with international trade and target a specific corporation, right? So I guess the data quality might change. Now, moving forward, is that a concern? So in terms of could data collected from investigation during 2025 and 2026 be combined with prior data? Is that an issue?
Well, yes, but now we are just preparing the revision of the database. We revise that as we move on, also because we had the fortune of having some research money from the European Union, Horizon project. So during the last 2 years, we could invest a bit to update the database, and now we have a new one. By the way, it's totally available. If anyone wants to use that, it's just email me. But it's also on the web of this European Union project. It's totally available for free by definition. And so yeah, in principle, yes, we are facing some issues because one of the important base of information was this trace report, and it seems that it's not available anymore. So, but yeah, but then if we focus on our FCPA cases, those are available anyway because there are all the databases of the DOJ and so forth. So if the focus is just on US cases, then yes. If the focus is on all the countries, then it's expensive, to get this data because you want to be careful. You have to look at several sources. You have to do open source desk research, and it's been a lot of work. We started doing this database like 15 years ago. I mean, I'm ashamed to report that because so much time has gone. But you do things when you have some little research money. It works. Yeah, you have to be pragmatic.
Yes. Thank you. No, I mean, it's very impressive what you have constructed here. We have a couple of hands up. First, Alexander, and then Francesco.
Thank you, Joseph. Please tell me if I'm wrong, but I'm so worried about the results that you show, Professor, because this really undermines, I believe, what we always said about corruption, or one of the reasons to fight corruption, maybe a bad reason, but was that as a company being clean is good for business, basically. It's just what you show is not that, and that's your conclusion. And I'm just worried that this really undercuts one of the main arguments that is always used. Again, I don't think it's the right argument, but it's one that is most commonly used, as countries for policies to say it's good for business, but maybe it is not, right? So am I right to see this problem appearing on the horizon here, or not?
I think, Alexander, I have to be very careful in the wording that I choose to answer, because I don't want to be the one who says that corruption is good, not here nor anywhere. Okay. No, but joking aside, what we are so corruption, we have so many good reasons and empirical evidence to say that corruption, paying bribes, is bad. But for a single company, paying bribes can be very good. You know, if you get away with that, you get a fat contract. Hey, that's perfect. And our data goes in that direction. So it's not inefficiency. The ones that are repeated offenders, they have a higher propensity to do that. They've been rewarded by the market. This is what we observe. Okay, but this certainly does not mean that corruption is good. But for this person who gets away with that, yes, it is good, and this is what our data supports. I don't think this contradicts our beliefs about corruption. Actually, you know, things that we observe must be good for someone. But forgive me if I, you know, make such an obvious statement. But yeah. Thank you.
Do you hear me?
Sì, sì, Francesco, piacere di vederti, rivederti. Sorry, in Italian, now switch to English. You are in Kenya, right?
Yeah, I'm in Kenya. Good to see you, Lucio, and thank you very much the presentation. Very interesting.
Thank you for being here.
Also, thank you. Also a bit disheartening for our work, of course.
Yeah.
I just have perhaps a question, a methodological question. I'm sure you have been very thorough in the design of the methodology, but you know, in the recent months, 6-12 months, you know, all the stock market in the US has gone up. If you look at the S&P 500, so I mean, do you see a data that tells you that this specific company are not aligned with the S&P 500? Because if that's the case, then you know, then they are outliers, you know, on the broad market, right? Because if that's not the case, you could say like, look, I mean, but all the market has gone up.
Yeah. No, I get the point. Sure.
So, but I just wanted to hear from that because that's you know, also, you know, you look at foreign companies, but also foreign companies have not gone up as American companies. So that's one question, but more on the subject. You know, we are looking with concern, of course, at this CPA stop order and the consequences. You know, in the region. I work now in East Africa more prominently. Do you see perhaps other countries, you know, stepping up their work? I don't know if you have looked at. I mean, I'm looking at the UK and France because of the UK Bribery Act and the Sapin 2 law that, you know, are recent, I mean, relatively recent law that are quite in a way represent similarities now with the FCPA. And do you think that we can count on Europe perhaps to take forward a little bit this area of foreign bribery? Do you have any data? I think you already answered that you don't, but you know, are you planning to look at data from and that's, I mean, do you have a sense that is there any proportion whereby it makes sense to take a look at this data, or you know, the enforcement from these other jurisdictions are so little that, you know, practically they don't compare to what the FCPA and the represented the DOJ has been doing? Because if really, you know, Europe now wants to perhaps counterbalance this trend, there should be some policy action, some, you know, push for this enforcement behind these, specifically these two laws. But let's not forget, most of the European countries now have foreign bribery laws in one way or another. So it would be interesting to look at those. And I was wondering if you have an opinion or, you know, an idea.
Listen, regarding let me start with the first one. So yeah, obviously, but the things are done in a way, Francesco, where you compare the past offenders with a group of companies that are comparable to them. Let me not consider details, the statistical methodology, but there are more than one way. So we do like a whole set of robustness tests. Actually, Francesca, I will email you the article, but separately after we finish. But yeah, you compare those that have been offenders with a group of other companies that look as similar as possible instead of the statistical sense. That's a logic, but they've not been past offenders. So the difference that you see is between the group the treated group, as we say, so the group that have been past offenders with the group that is comparable in a statistical sense, but they've not been the target of FCPA before. I save you the details of the methodology. I mean, it's kind of, but I send you the paper, and then if you have questions, concrete questions, I will be glad to talk to you. Though the second question is too complicated. I'm sorry. No, meaning that I can tell you, I think I should distinguish sharply my opinions as a researcher, and then my simple answer is I don't know, with my desire as a citizen of a European country, which is precisely to go in that direction. I mean, I don't think that appeasing what's been going on at more than one level, forgive me if I enlarge, the topic of the conversation a little bit, is going to do Europe any good, and my country, Europe, any good. So it would be desirable on whether it to have a stance also on this issue. But I see it also complicated because I also observe the contradictions of not just in my country but in other European countries of the compliance to the FCPA that you are very well aware on. I mean, if you read the reports of the working group on OECD on our European countries, you will see that there are problems that occasionally come. Let me not elaborate further on the presence of so-called national champions that are very difficult to deal with. And paradoxically, they become more difficult in a situation where Europe feels threatened, and these national champions, in a way, become even more important because you want to defend them. So I'm not very optimistic, to be honest, but certainly I think that it would be advisable to go precisely in that direction, that is to work together in order to keep the OECD at the European level, the OECD ABC alive, and also to have some bargaining power in case the targeting from abroad really becomes a serious issue, which so far is not. I mean, I don't have the data, as I said, but certainly at all levels, also I think at the level of the organization, the important organization for which you work, it's even if you're focused on Africa now, but at a more general level, we should certainly monitor these very closely. Our data certainly tell us that this has to be monitored if we care. Sorry for not being able to provide, a more, but yeah, it's a honest answer at least.
Okay.
Well,
thank you.
If there are no other questions, I would like to start closing up this session. First, of course, by thanking Lucio for a wonderful presentation. And it's the second time that I see some of these data, and now I got to see the updated or the additional one from the latest paper that you published, which again is such an interesting work. It's built on an impressive amount of data collected and organized. So thank you so much, and it's great to hear that it's available also for access and for other researchers to continue working with it. So yeah, I very much look forward to the next steps in continue analyzing these transnational corruption trends and to continue the conversation going.
Joseph, thank you very much. Thank you all for being here and we'll certainly continue our conversation.
Yes, and thank you everyone else, of course, for joining us today. See you everyone. Take good care.
Bye bye.